We are in Chayei Adam, Klal Kuf Chaf Aleph, and in this simon, in this chapter, we're learning about 121. This chapter 121. They're learning about the what is considered full chametz, what's a mixture of chametz, and when are these things applied before the holiday of Pesach, and what is considered chametz nuksha. Chametz that has become solid isn't really an edible item, but is still so recognizable as its original edible form. So there's three types of chametz. Something called sour, which is sourdough, and then there is edible chametz, so the type of leaven product that one could normally eat, and it's not mixed into anything else. Then there is a second type, which is full chametz that is mixed into something else bigger than itself. Generally, it's going to be a leaven product mixed into a liquid of some kind. The third type is always mentioned as chametz nuksha, which means that it is leaven that has spoiled, that doesn't really is not really consumable and never has been. So, for example, these include types of paste that's sofrim, that people who would stick together their papers would use to stick the pages together, and they would mix it to for the agglutination with water and flour, and the gluten would cause it to stick. Or it's not really full-fledged chametz. For example, if you have sourdough which has not really fully soured, it's not there yet. So it's not edible because it's like a rock, but it's also not really sourdough because it hasn't started to really become a growth point for sourdough in order to use it for its leavening purposes. Some also say that flour, when it's mixed with water and with fruit juice, is also considered chametz nuksha. And there's a lot of different ways that this law goes. However, let's point out some very obvious things. Someone who eats full-fledged leaven products and the size of a kazayas, who does it on Pesach and they eat it, the punishment enumerated by the Torah is kares, extirpation, cut off from the Jewish people in the afterlife. If that chametz is in a mixture, okay, even though you haven't eaten a kazayas, nonetheless, there's still the prohibition of you have eaten something that contains chametz. It still has the flavor of full-fledged chametz in it. So you haven't eaten the actual thing, but you still have been consuming the flavors of it, which is there is a prohibition stated specifically in the Torah against mixtures. Even though there isn't a kazayas right now, the problem is that you would get one if you were to eat it all in what's known as the time it would take you to normally eat a piece of bread. So if you were to continue to consume this mixture product at a quick rate, you would get the kazayas, but the way most people eat it, you don't actually get the kazayas. So the punishment is a little bit lower, but nonetheless prohibited by the Torah. Now, if it is mixed into the same type of mixture, which is known as min b'mino, which is if you took flour and you took flour that was made from kernels which had been soaked before they were ground, and they were mixed into flour that's for Pesach, which has to be dry all the time. If that would be considered nullified in the majority, since according to Torah law, that would be permitted to have one mixed into the other. So that would normally permit it to be consumed, because the Torah says that there's a general rule that you follow the majority of a dry mixture when it's the same type of mixture. And this law is universal across all of the prohibitions in the Torah. And if so, it would be permitted to keep this flour around by Torah law as well. Nonetheless, the rabbis required you to destroy it before Pesach because of making no distinctions for the Pesach holiday. Now, the rule is different when the types are different, which is to say, let's say you have a mixture of chametz, such as you have in what was known as this Babylonian dip called kutach. Even if you had mixed in enough other mixtures, which was things like milk and other such things into the mixtures, until you don't have this kazayas, that you don't have enough chametz in proportion to how much liquid is there, whereby within the time period of eating a slice of bread you could consume this kazayas, which would seem to exclude it from the Torah prohibition. Nonetheless, the rabbis required you to get rid of it. So the one we mentioned earlier is where you could consume a kazayas, you could consume the prohibited amount within this requisite time. But here we're saying if you have a greater proportion of liquid, you're still required rabbinically to remove it from your house, because it's nonetheless considered chametz that is connected in some way, somehow, and would be included under the prohibition of bal yira'eh, which we talked about in a previous class. And so too, further extension from this, if you were to mix wheat kernels that had sprouted into a larger silo where there's all types of grains in there, you'd have to get rid of all of that as well, which we mentioned also a couple chapters ago, because these grains are considered not mixed, but recognizable in the mixture. And everything that's recognizable is not considered nullified. It has to be irrecognizable. Otherwise, if you recognize it, simply remove it. So that's the din of a mixture of chametz. Going back to chametz nuksha, chametz which is not really edible and has never actually been edible, by Torah law, it's not included in the bal yira'eh prohibition. Nonetheless, rabbinically, you still have to remove it from your house on Pesach, because again, the rabbis did not make a distinction. However, if it is something that was nuksha, that became inedible and was also mixed into something else, then it's not something you can keep around. So here's what we learned from these rules: that anything that has full-fledged chametz in it of any kind, if it's edible chametz, it must be removed from the house. If it doesn't actually have noticeable chametz, but it has the flavor of chametz in it, so if you went and cooked chametz in something, even though you took the chametz out afterwards and there's nothing left but the flavor, nonetheless, you are still the Torah still makes you obligated on it, and you must remove it, because the rule is that the flavor is the same as the original object as a Torah prohibition. The Torah prohibits that. And as far as the prohibition of bal yira'eh, of not seeing chametz in your possession, some poskim, this is the Chok Yaakov, this says is he's questionable if you actually violate it in this case, which is just the flavor. The Mishnah Berurah brings down that it is certainly rabbinically prohibited to keep it around. And if you did keep it around and it stayed through all of Pesach, some people say that it is only prohibited to eat after Pesach, but you could sell it. And some people say that you can't even sell it. And if there's a great loss in a case like this, you could be lenient, because this opinion that we just mentioned is not sure if it's just a flavor, if it's an actual violation of Torah law or not. If something has no chametz in it at all, but was cooked in chametz kalim, so it was cooked in non-Passover dishes that were within the 24-hour period. So you cooked, let's say you cooked something that had noodles in it. You cooked noodles in your pot, and then afterwards you take vegetables only, and you cook the vegetables in that pot. So now you didn't put chametz in it, but the chametz flavor went from the water to the pot and now to the vegetables. Or you then took those vegetables and that you cooked the noodles in, and then soaked them in that pot. Even though you're not allowed to eat it on Pesach, according to everybody's opinion, some people say you are allowed to keep it around. This is according to the Chayei Adam. And the Mishnah Berurah says on this halacha, he says it's only if was not left to soak in this pot during Pesach. So it was taken out of the Chometz pot on Pesach, because we don't allow you to use tam fagam. We don't allow you to use ruined flavor in the utensil. We don't permit that on Pesach. So we're talking about if you did this before Pesach and took it out, you could keep it around through Pesach because you did it before Pesach. But if you did this on Pesach, done. Okay. And the Chayei Adam echoes this as well. He says, but if you did this cooking on Pesach, and even if the pot was more than 24 hours, you still have to get rid of it, because we say that we don't rely on the rule of nosin tam fagam, the rule of that after 24 hours the flavor is no longer substantial on Pesach. Halacha Beis over here. Something that's known as davar hama'amid. So if something is used as a preservative of some kind, or it keeps the food from spoiling, or keeps it in its position, keeps it as it is. So that item is considered as if it is noticeable, and is therefore not nullified, no matter how many times, even up to 1,000 times. So therefore, if you make cheese from vinegar, and the vinegar came from some type of beer, or vinegar that came from some type of beer dregs, you have to get rid of it. So vinegar cheeses are usually softer cheeses. So we're saying that if you went ahead and made something like a pot cheese or a farmer cheese, you have to get rid of it. And so too, if you made this honey dish known as mead, and this is something where you take water and honey and cook them together to make this thinner drink, and it became fermented from the leftover dregs of this honey that you have cooked in all year long. So you ferment it a little bit using some of the leftover dregs of the honey mead. And the very first honey that was used was cooked in these beer, which was probably made from wheat beer or barley beer. And now you are on the 4th or 5th cycle of making your mead from this one. You have to get rid of it. The Mishnah Berurah say over here, if you did not get rid of this mead, then some people are allowed to be lenient and sell it after Pesach. This is assuming that this was the only thing that made your beer at that time, or made your drink at that time. But if there was some other permitted one, so for example, if you used the honey with a first-time honey thing along with the old one, so this is something called zevizagorim. The rule here is that it's not, the one item is not responsible for it alone, and we therefore permit this. And that's assuming that you have, this Mishnah Berurah adds in this halacha, you have to have 60 times against these beer dregs. So that way the flavor isn't given off. Because if you get the taste, we already said in the previous halacha that that's no good. And anything made like this at the very beginning, for example, anything mixed with vinegar or any other type of mixtures with some type of leavened object, and that comes from leaven, it's never going to be nullified, because it's considered the item that preserves this item, and therefore you know that item is there. Nonetheless, this prohibition is a rabbinic one, and therefore, after the fact, if you forgot to get rid of it before Pesach, and it spent all Pesach in your home, in the back of your fridge, bothering nobody until you notice it after Pesach, in a case of a great loss, where you have this tons of farmer cheese sitting back there, for example, it would be permitted to benefit from it, so you could sell it to a non-Jew, as long as you take the value of the preservative, so in this case the vinegar, for example, and throw it into the sea. He actually says the Dead Sea, but since if the Dead Sea is not available, find another sea, find another lake. The idea is that the non should benefit from the money. Now, if you use a cow's stomach, which had been left to be stored in liquid in a kli, in a utensil that was used for cooking leaven products, used for cooking chometz, you cannot eat this cheese, but definitely keep it around. So we're saying this is a little bit more lenient. Mishnah Berurah says over here, so this is only going to be a problem if the amount of stomach lining is more than 60 times. But before Pesach, you could even you could go ahead and keep that cheese around. But if it's on Pesach, then there's no leniency for this case. So now we're on Halacha Gimel. Our beer and our spirits, these are considered full-fledged Chometz, and so too any dregs from them that we use to process other items from them. Halacha Daled. Any Chometz that is edible, even though it goes bad, nonetheless you have to get rid of it. Unless it's so far bad that not even a dog would touch it before the time when the prohibition sets in. Because once it gets that bad, it's considered dirt, and dirt is not prohibited. But nonetheless, even if it's dirt, you can't eat this Chometz dirt. And if it sticks around through Pesach, into Pesach, and becomes this disgusting into Pesach, you have to get rid of it, which we mentioned already in Kuf Yates, in 119 above. And we're not sure, the Mishnah Berurah adds over here, we're not sure if this is a rabbinic or a Torah level prohibition. And this is only assuming that it went bad on Pesach. But if it went bad before Pesach, it is permitted to keep it around, and you can benefit from it after Pesach, but definitely can't eat it. Halacha Hey now. Clothing that is washed in wheat milk, which is some type of detergent that they used to use back in the day, and starch, because you would starch it. Okay, so you would cook this a lot, and that would be in there, so you could get rid of it. You could keep it around. Nonetheless, it's prohibited to lay these types of clothing onto the table, especially if they have any type of amount of wheat on them, especially if it might crumple off and land in your food. And so too, you can't store Pesach flour in them. So you can keep them around, but you can't use them for your Pesach food. Vav, Halacha 6. One is allowed to adhere pieces of paper to the window within 30 days of Pesach, as long as the Chometz is not recognized when you adhere the paper. Because this item is considered Chometz Nuksha, it's considered hardened Chometz. It was never meant to be eaten, and you're never going to eat this because you can't eat it. But the rabbis didn't want to make a distinction. So in this case, where it's covered up with paper and it's not possible, even if it was edible, to go ahead and eat it, they didn't include it in this prohibition in this case. But if you can see the pieces of wheat paste on the outside, then it's prohibited. But before 30 days, everything is permitted. The Mishnah Berurah adds that some people are lenient as long as it's all completely dried out, even if you can see the Chometz, and as long as it's as what you can see is less than the size of a kazayas, less than the size of an olive, even within 30 days, one doesn't have to get rid of it either. So he's a little bit more lenient, the Mishnah Berurah, than the Chayei Adam. So the next halacha, Zion, number 7, if you have ink, and you cook your ink, so you probably took ash in this case, and you cook it in beer before Passover, you can write with it. And if a non-Jew makes this ink with beer on Pesach, you can't buy the ink from him, because the Chometz, the leavened products that belong to a non-Jew, in this case the beer, are prohibited to be benefited from on Pesach even by a Jewish person. And so too, full-fledged leaven products that are mixed into other foods that are not for human consumption at all, such as items used by tanners, and you put flour into the tanning material and you put the skins into it. Even if you threw the stuff together an hour before the time you were required to get rid of your Chometz and nullify it, or you spent even a few days earlier, like 3 days earlier, and put the flour into this tanning solution, and then it became completely inedible and ruined based on its mixture. And so too, any type of paste or chalk or something, or some type of bandages that are using flour as an adhesive of some kind, and you use them together, these things are permitted to be kept around through Pesach because they don't look like Chometz at all. Halacha Ches, number 8. Chometz on Pesach is prohibited by Torah law, and those Torah laws were actually equivalent to every other prohibition in the Torah. And that meant that the flavor of Chometz would only be a prohibited product up until 60 times the amount. But the rabbis of the Talmud were more strict, and they prohibited the mixtures even when it was the same type, and so much more so when they were of different types in the smallest amount. And that prohibition extends even to benefiting from it. And the rule is that you must burn everything, and you can't redeem the value of it to keep it around and try to sell whatever's left over, or even try to sell it to a non-Jew, even though it's not worth very much when you calculate how much a little tiny piece of Chometz actually fell into it. Nonetheless, the accepted custom is to destroy it and not keep it around. So the Mishnah Berurah says about this, that there are people who say that if you go ahead and throw out the value of the Chometz, that would make it okay, and then you could go ahead and sell it to a non-Jew. But this is only be permissible in a case of great need and a significant loss. But this is a very unique leniency. But he brings it up in case of a great financial loss. And same thing too, if you have a great financial loss, the Mishnah Berurah says you can be lenient and sell these products to non-Jews. Mishnah Berurah being super lenient in this case. The utensils that were used to cook with this Pesach, during Pesach with this little bit of Chometz, are allowed to be kept around until end of Pesach and do not need to be smashed. You are also then allowed to cook in them, whether it's the same type of item, meaning you can cook more Chometz in there, so like wheat Chometz or barley Chometz, or anything else that's not the same type of thing after Pesach, because the flavor can stick around, no problem. If the mixture is mixed into other things, that mixture becomes prohibited in the smallest amount in that second mixture. And then what you have is something known as 2 small amounts. So it's allowed to be infinitesimally small, and it basically infects the next thing. And we say that this is the final decision of all of those of all halachic deciders. Which means when you have a cooked food in which you find a kernel, let's say like a wheat kernel. So everything that came in contact with it, the ladle, the pot, and everything that came in contact with it, every single one of them are not kosher for Passover anymore. And if you then took that ladle and stirred another pot with it, everything is prohibited. Okay? The Mishnah Berurah says it has to still be boiling. So I'm assuming it's because if it's not, it needs heat in order to transfer the flavor, is what he's trying to point out. In the book Eliyah Rabbah, he adds the following: only by ladles are we stringent like this, because it has nothing else to offer from itself meaning it absorbs the flavors from the fact that it's submerged in all the types of foods. So that's only, and that's why it's here as well, because it's using some type of liquid to transfer. But if it was dry, that had a little bit mixed in, and that gets mixed into another thing, and there's a majority against the second mixture, and you recognize the second thing that fell in there, everything else can be saved by doing that. But if you don't recognize the part that fell in, everything's prohibited. And in case of great loss, and you're going to ruin your holiday, and any other reasons that you could add to this to be lenient, there are opinions who say that you could go ahead and use this as a reason to permit the second mixture. The Mishnah Berurah says over here that if you're using it constantly, this type of utensil, and you need it, you could kosher it. You could even eat it, he says, in a case of great need. In the case of the second mixture, by the smallest amount. And the Chayei Adam himself continues, when you have lots of reasons to be lenient, you can go ahead and finally add the opinion of the She'iltos, one of the earliest Rishonim. He actually was one of the Gaonim, who says that there is no stringency for Chometz on Pesach, and 60 times would be fine. And that is the final leniency to allow us to go ahead and be even more lenient when you have multiple considerations to be lenient. And as we will learn later on, we'll see also we'll be lenient in cases of mixtures. And if we apply that rule to our case, which is to say, for a fact that a small amount mixed in, and we're going to say that there's going to be two small mixtures, the initial one and then the second one. That's where we need lots and lots of additional leniencies. But if we're not sure if it fell in, and into the first mixture, and then it fell into a second mixture, we don't extend this stringency on small amounts to a second mixture. It's true that where you say, yeah, it fell in right now, and if that's the case, you can rely on those opinions who say that we don't assume that something fell in at a previous time. So if we see it now, we're going to say that it fell in now. So this would be the first mixture, and whatever previous admixture had been was not considered mixed if you didn't see it in there. But this rule doesn't apply by other doubts. It's a leniency here because this is an accessible stringency. Halacha 9. So when do all of these leniencies apply? So this rule applies by something that is prohibited in other prohibitions, not Chometz, and that prohibition applies to when it absorbs the flavor, and you need another level of volume to nullify it. But if something in other mixtures doesn't need to be nullified, but rather it only says that it needs to have a rinsing, or you have to just scrape off a surface or cut off a surface. So these stringencies in Mashahu of the smallest amount, then this is going to be different in cases where it has very small absorption levels. And so that rule is equivalent in case of Chometz. So if we say you just have to rinse it off, so if you have Chometz that touches chicken, and they're both cold and dry, so that's going to be just rinse it off. So if you cut something for Pesach with a knife that was used for Chometz, and these things aren't sharp, whereby the sharpness would transfer the flavor, even if they were used to cut hot chametz that day and they were never cleaned. But since in all other prohibited cases, a prohibited matter would only need to be rinsed in this case or scrubbed gently, in our case by chametz, that would suffice as well. Nonetheless, after the fact, if you went ahead and didn't scrub it clean and then you cooked it in something else, okay, or in some other situation where it was needed to be rinsed or scrubbed, and you didn't do that, so even though in other cases after the fact that you did that, it would be permitted by chametz, since we say that it's even a mashu, even a little bit, it would prohibit it because you still have that's what you got. And that's what you got, and that's what you get. That's what you got. You got a mashu, so what you get is it's no good. Mishnah Berurah says over here, in case of great need, one could be lenient in this case. And the Chayei Adam quotes the Eliyah Rabbah again. If it's something that just kind of crumbles easily, but if something is for certain contains a small amount and doesn't get rinsed at all, then there's no room for leniency. But I think the Mishnah Berurah's point is that he disagrees with that as well. Okay. Let's finish up. Let's call it a night here. This is pretty intense stuff.